On a Saturday afternoon, a little over 4 years ago, I received a call from a lady that I've known for a long time. I had met her and her husband many years ago when I was preaching in a meeting at the Inglewood Church in Los Angeles. We'd stayed in touch through the years. When she called, she said that she was in Houston, that she was here for a seminar somehow connected with her profession as a speech therapist. And she wanted to go to worship the following morning, and she was wondering if I could point her to a church that was close to where she was staying. She was staying in a hotel in the Woodlands. And I looked around a little bit and I said, I think that the closest church probably to you is the Woodland Oaks Church. And I said, I really have never been there and I don't know anything about that church. But I said, I don't have a preaching appointment in the morning, so why don't I come by your hotel and pick you up and we'll go to Woodland Oaks Church together. That's what we did. It was a wonderful experience, far beyond anything that I had anticipated. The song service was exhilarating. As those of you know, when Sonny raises his baton, it's going to be a pretty good thing. The prayers were very touching. The Lord's Supper was handled so beautifully, and the sermon was extraordinarily good. It was just a wonderful experience all the way around. And when we had the service and it was over, I had some bonuses coming because I met some people that I had some connection with in the past. I met Judy Tarver, whose preacher father, Guy Gasky, had been a very good friend of mine. I met one of your elders, Mark Freeman, who came to me and he told me a story that I was totally unaware of. If I remember it correctly, he grew up in Fort Worth, and as a child, he attended a church where my father was an elder. And he said my father had showed a special interest in him and had encouraged him, and it had been a very great blessing in his life. I think that part of that story went this way, although he didn't state it quite this way. My father was a fisherman, and what he did with Mark Freeman was that he baited his hook with candy, and he reeled him in. I'd always wondered what happened to my Halloween candy. My father was taking my stash and giving it to other people. But it was a wonderful experience to meet Mark and find out what had happened in his life. And then I met a number of other people that I had encountered somewhere along the way when I was preaching, and I met some people who had been students at Texas Tech and Lubbock Christian when I was preaching for the Broadway Church in Lubbock. It was an exhilarating experience. When we left, this lady was just exuberant. She was talking about what a wonderful song service we had and how everything went so well, and she was profuse in her statements concerning the sermon. She said, I haven't heard a sermon like that in a long time. That's one of the finest sermons that I ever heard. I agreed that it was really outstanding. But I said, I know how this stuff works. So let me tell you what was happening here this morning. It's obvious that that church is searching for a preacher. And they have narrowed their list, and now they're bringing those who had made the cut, they're bringing them in for a tryout sermon. And when a preacher does his tryout sermon, it's the very best sermon that he has in his arsenal. There's nothing else quite like it. And I said, that's what we heard this morning. We heard that man's very best sermon. I wanted to get back to Woodland Oaks, and I did very shortly after that. And the same thing happened. It was a wonderful service. And I was surprised when the same man got up to preach. And I thought, well, he made the cut. And he's back for a second shot. And this won't be as good as the first one because that was his best. It'll be good, but it won't be as good as the first one. But it was. And I was looking at the worship bulletin, and it said that the pulpit minister was Ken Stegall. And I knew that was the name of the man who was preaching, and so I thought, well, that means that he is the pulpit preacher here today. But I asked somebody after the service, I said, is that your regular preacher? They said, yeah. He's been with us 8 or 9 years. I thought, this is really something. I mean, this guy's got it together. The service was uplifting, and I've been many times to Woodland Oaks since then, and somehow I was just feeling that I wanted to have sort of a heart-to-heart with you this morning. Dr. Norval Young was one of my predecessors at the Broadway Church in Lubbock, and he left that pulpit to become president of Pepperdine University, Pepperdine College at the time. He was a remarkable man. He was a dynamo of positive thinking. He was a believer in people. He was an extraordinary encourager. For several years, I was on the Pepperdine campus after they moved to Malibu 3 or 4 times a year. And the thing that I probably enjoyed most about those visits was walking the campus with Norval Young. He cheerfully greeted everybody that we met. And to every one of them, he said exactly the same thing. You're doing more good than you know. You're doing more good than you know. That's what he said to administrators and to professors and to groundskeepers and to custodians and to cafeteria workers and to students, to everybody. He said, you're doing more good than you know. That would have resonated with the Apostle Paul. Because when Paul came to the close of his Roman letter, chapter 16, he named 27 people, called 27 people out by name, people who were doing more good than they knew. A few of them you've heard of. Most of them you haven't. Because nowhere else in your Bible do you ever come across the name of Epaenetus or Andronicus or Ampliatus or Urbanus or Tryphena and Tryphosa or most of the others. This is the only place that you ever see them. And it may seem a little bit strange to us that the greatest theological document in history, that comes from Ken Stegall, by the way, the greatest theological document in history, especially the first 8 chapters, would take up space to list the names of a bunch of people who were unknown, except in their own small circle, in their own community. But you know, folks, that's the way God built his church. That's the way God still builds his church. He builds his church with the words and the acts of people who are not looking for notoriety, who are not wanting recognition, who are only seeking to glorify God and build his church where they are in their own corner of the world by being the people that they're supposed to be and doing more good than they know. You know, when I think of the Woodland Oaks Church, which I do very often, I think of a bunch of extraordinary people, or maybe in some cases, ordinary people who are just doing extraordinary good work, who have banded together to make their corner of the world a better place. People who do that by the way they live. People who have built a remarkable church by committing their money and their talents and their lives to God and all in the process doing more good than you know. This church is relatively young. I think about 30 years. If I recall, 1992 was the beginning, so 29 or 30 years. You've accomplished a lot in these 3 decades. More than you know, I'm sure. I don't really know much about the history of Woodland Oaks. I don't know the details of what has gone into bringing this church to where it is today. But I do know enough about church work to know that it hadn't always been easy. I do know that there have been difficult decisions that have had to be made. And you know, when you have a large group of people and decisions have to be made, not everybody's going to agree with those. There have been times, I am certain, that there have been tensions. I imagine that there have been some bruised feelings somewhere along the way. But you know what? You have grown in the process and you have learned how to be family, and a lot of churches never do learn that. But you have learned it. You've learned how to give up some of your own personal preferences for the good of the whole, and you've developed a beautiful spiritual maturity all along the way. You know, in Paul's introductory remarks in his letter to the Philippians, which was read as our text a little bit ago, he looked both to the past and to the future. Concerning the past, he said, I thank my God every time I remember you. Pretty good compliment. I thank my God every time I remember you. And concerning the future, he said, I am confident that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. God is nowhere close to finished with the Woodland Oaks Church. These first 30 years are just the beginning. You have a future that's a beautiful future that God will see through to completion. You know, Paul's first words in that text express the feelings that I have very much for this church. I thank my God every time I remember you. You're what a church ought to be. Jesus said, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. You do that as well as any church I know. You know, the Apostle John, when he exited Patmos, came back, he landed in Ephesus, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. He spent the rest of his life in Ephesus. He apparently saw something missing there that troubled him a little bit. And I say that because tradition has it that in every assembly of that church, all the way to the point when he was an old man and had to be helped up to the platform, in every single assembly of that church, he had a 5-word admonition. Little children, love one another. Every single service, little children, love one another. That isn't an admonition that you need because you do love one another. You know, Paul said in Galatians chapter 6, carry each other's burdens. That's just the way you do it at Woodland Oaks. He said in Ephesians chapter 4, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. That's the way you do it at Woodland Oaks. He said, encourage one another. Build each other up in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 3 verses later, he said, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone. That's the way you do it at Woodland Oaks. Some of you receive a little email devotional that I send out Monday through Friday of each week, just a little short devotional. I had an exchange with a lady who receives that not too long ago. I've known her for many years. She's a wonderful lady. I had a call from her on a Sunday afternoon, and she said, "Joe, I want to continue to receive your email devotionals, but except for that, I'm quitting." I didn't know what she was talking about. I said, "What do you mean you're quitting?" "Quitting what?" She said, "The church. I'm quitting the church." And I said, "No, you're not quitting." I said, "Something's happened. I don't know what it is, but it'll pass. You've been involved a long time. You're not going to quit." And she sort of snapped. She said, "I'm quitting." I said, "Well, can you tell me why? Tell me why you're quitting." She said, "It happened in church this morning." She said, "I got to looking around. I looked at people that I had been around for a long time. Some of them were church leaders, some of them were not. But," she said, "it kicked off something that had been simmering in me for years, and that something was, I was saying, nobody cares. Nobody cares." And I said, "What do you mean nobody cares?" She said, "Nobody in this church really cares about me. I don't think they even know who I am. And they don't care whether I live or die. They just simply don't care." And she said, "It's that way everywhere." She said, "It's that way in all of our churches." She said, "I've visited other congregations and not even been spoken to. They don't care." And she said, "Every one of our churches are that way." And I said, "No, they're not. You're wrong about that. You've just had a bad day. You'll get over it. Take a couple of aspirins and get a good night's sleep. Things will be better tomorrow. I know," I said, "that some of our churches could brush up on their friendliness, but you're wrong. They're not all cold and uncaring." And she said, "Yes, they are." I said, "You know, in my time, I've had the privilege of traveling pretty much all over this country, speaking in our churches, and I've seen a lot of places where they care for each other. They really do." She said, "Where?" I said, "Well, a lot of places." She said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, really." She said, "Name one, Joe." She said, "Name one." "You cannot name a single one. Name just one." And I said, "Okay." I gave her your name. Let's stand and sing.